John Jones and his family were avid spelunkers, which is a term given to people who explore underground caves. In November of 2009, 26-year-old John was back home in Utah celebrating Thanksgiving with his family. During his visit, someone in his family suggested they go cave exploring like old times as a way to kind of reconnect. And so John, along with his younger brother Josh, who was 23 at the time, and 9 other friends and family got together and headed off to Nutty Putty Cave, which was a very popular spelunking location in their area that no one in his family had actually explored. On November 24th, 2009, around 8 p.m., John and his brother, along with the rest of their friends and family, enter Nutty Putty Cave, and they make their way to the section called the Big Slide. It was not particularly challenging, and John, even though he had not been cave exploring in a really long time, felt like he could do something more difficult. So he and his brother decide to split off from the main group and make their way over to the most challenging section of the cave, known as the birth canal. So John and Josh start making their way over towards that section of the cave. They have a map and they're kind of trying to follow as best as they can. And John, who was leading the pair, stops when he gets to this waist-high hole in the wall that he believes is the entrance to the birth canal. When John was growing up and he used to go cave exploring with his family, he was much smaller. He was a kid. Now he's a grown man. He's 6 foot, over 200 pounds, but he still had the mindset of when he was a kid. And so like a child, he sees this hole and literally goes headfirst into it without any second thoughts. So John begins painstakingly inching his way down this tunnel that's completely tight on his body. His arms are pinned under his body, and with every movement he's making, he's getting tighter and tighter. But he's convinced that this is the birth canal and that it just takes certain people that are brave enough to push past that discomfort, that claustrophobia, that if you just push past this tight section, you'll get to a place where it opens up. So John, believing this is the birth canal, kept going farther and farther into this tunnel until he's completely wedged. He has a little bit of tunnel still in front of him that actually kind of bends down in front of him. And he thinks, man, that's it. I just got to go all the way down there and I can get into that opening. And so he's caught up against a lip of rock that's underneath his ribs. And so in order to get past it, he breathes all of the air out of his lungs and he pushes himself just past the lip. And then he breathes in again, and his chest expands, and his rib cage is literally caught up on that lip because he's now moved past it. He can't bring himself back over the lip. And what's worse is as soon as he got over that little lip, he got a better view into this hole he was going down, and it dead ends. It just gets to a point. There was nothing there. It was not the birth canal. It was an unmarked tunnel somewhere in this cave. So he's trapped, and he knows it. And to make matters even worse, John was almost completely upside down. John yells to his brother and says he's stuck. Josh starts going down this tunnel and he almost immediately gets stuck. And from where he is, he can barely see his brother, who's way down this tiny little tunnel. And he knows that if he's stuck up here, his brother's really stuck. This is a very, very bad situation they're in. So Josh barely gets himself out of this tunnel and he yells to John that he's going to go get help. But it would take 3.5 hours for the first rescue worker to arrive on scene because they are way down into this cave. This is not an easy to access area. Susie Matola was the first rescue person, and when she arrived, she said, "Hey John, how you doing down there?" And Susie would say that John sounded very distant, and he just said, "Hi Susie, thanks for coming, but I really, really want to get out." Susie immediately reassured John that she will have him out in no time. Everything's going to be just fine. But when Susie looked down into this tiny little space that John was stuck in, she thought this is going to take a really long time to get him out. I mean, just to set up a pulley system to try to pull him out is going to take a long time. And then inching a 6 foot, 200 pound man out of this tiny space, that's going to take hours and maybe even days. But unfortunately, John didn't have the time. The human body is designed to be upright, with gravity helping your heart pump blood to the rest of your body. When you're inverted, blood pools in your brain and your heart cannot work fast or hard enough to get it out in time, and so it eventually causes your body to shut down. So when the trauma physician saw that John was inverted and he had already been there for 3.5 hours before rescuers even got to him, he told Susie and the rest of the rescuers that John maybe has 8 to 10 hours left to live. The rescuers tried everything to try to get John out of the cave. They put a rope around his legs and tried yanking him out. didn't work. They set up an elaborate pulley system. It barely worked, but they kept falling out of the wall, and so it was taking all this time just to get set up, only to move him a fraction of an inch. They got drills and chisels, and they went down into the tunnel and began trying to chisel John out. But again, it was almost negligible progress, and it was just taking too much time. As the rescuers are doing everything they can to try to get him out, they noticed that John's breathing was becoming labored and his voice sounded nasally, indicating that more and more fluid was building up now inside of his lungs, and that probably they were within the last few hours that he was going to be alive. At some point, they finally got John to move just a couple of inches using this really elaborate pulley system that they had found a way to stay anchored in the walls, but they saw there was a huge problem. No matter what system they were going to use to get John out of this hole, due to the angle of the cave he had crawled into, his legs would not fit. They would not bend in the right direction on the way out. They would have to break his legs in order to curve him around this bend in the cave. With John's breathing already labored and him being basically unresponsive at this point, they figured that if they broke his legs, that would just send him into shock and kill him anyways. And so they realized that they cannot get John out of this cave. He's going to die here. 27 hours after John had become stuck, he became unresponsive and he was declared dead. The 26-year-old medical student would leave behind his wife as well as their 1-year-old daughter, and his wife was due with their second child in June of the following year. Following John's death, Nutty Putty Cave was sealed off with cement, and John's body is still inside Nutty Putty Cave to this day. And here is a picture of John exploring Nutty Putty Cave before he ultimately made his way over to that fateful tunnel that he went in headfirst and ultimately died inside of. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know what you thought of these 3 stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please fling a rubber band at the like button and also subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username on both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mrballen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit. It's just called Mrballen. It's linked in the description below. I read that every day, and if I intentionally use your story, I will absolutely credit you. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Reddit, some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Ed Gein was always a little bit off. His classmates and his teachers recalled him being very shy, but at the same time, having these strange mannerisms where all of a sudden he would burst out hysterically laughing. Usually it's something he had been muttering to himself in class. The school blamed Ed's mother for Ed's kind of odd behavior, because Ed would admit that his mother punished him if he showed signs of having friends. So Ed's childhood was incredibly lonely and isolated. Ed's mother would confine he, along with his brother Henry, to their farm. He was basically never allowed to leave with the exception of school, and when he was at the farm, his mother would regularly read from the Bible and would tell Ed and his brother Henry that basically everybody else in the world is evil. We are the only pure ones. Everyone is evil and you should stay away from them. In 1944, when Ed was 38 years old, he and his brother Henry were burning away some marsh vegetation on their property. And at some point, the fire got out of control and the fire department had to be called in. And after they put out the fire, Ed was okay, but they couldn't find Henry. He was just gone. That night, Henry's body was found face down in the marsh in that same area where the burn was going on. He had died of asphyxiation. At first, the fire was blamed, but then authorities discovered that Henry had actually died before the fire started. And so all eyes turned to Ed, who was the only one with him at the time, but there was no hard evidence connecting Ed to Henry, and Ed said, "I didn't do it." So Henry's death remained labeled an accident, even though basically everyone believed that Ed must have been the guy that strangled his brother to death before the fire was set. Shortly after his brother's death, Ed's mother also died, leaving Ed alone in this farmhouse. Ed began to make some modifications to the farmhouse, not to improve it or to make it bigger and better, but rather to board off all of the rooms in the house that his mother ever used. He basically made them time capsules. He didn't touch them, he just sealed them off. And so he confined himself to a single room in this farmhouse that he did not take care of. And so filth is just piling up everywhere. And so he just kind of lived in squalor in this one weird room. While living in seclusion, Ed became obsessed with cannibalism. He basically spent all his time reading about cannibalism inside of this tiny room in his boarded up farmhouse. And that's how he lived his life for the next 10 years. No one really ever saw him. Then, in November of 1957, a local hardware store owner, her name was Bernice Worden, goes missing. When police show up at the store to have a look around, they find bloodstains all over the place, and they discover in the register that the last person to make a purchase inside of the store was Ed Gein. So they go to Ed Gein's house to interview him and see if he knows anything about Bernice Worden, and so they're bracing themselves for probably finding her body at Ed's house. But they were not prepared for what they actually found at his house. What they find would end up inspiring movies like Silence of the Lambs, Psycho, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Basically, inside of Ed's house was a whole bunch of human remains, but not in the way that you would imagine. Ed was taking human body parts and making things like kitchen utensils and bowls, and he was using skin to create seats and lampshades and bedposts. I mean, his whole house was like built of human bones and flesh. Bernice Worden's body was found as well, and she was kind of hung up as if she was next up to be made into some sort of kitchen utensil or chair or table. When questioned, Ed confessed to killing Bernice Worden, but as for the dozens of other bodies that were inside of the house, he claims they were from robbing graves, but no one really knew if that was true or not, and they weren't able to ever actually convict him for anything beyond the killing of Bernice Worden. As for his motive, he told investigators that what he really wanted to do, what he intended to do, was build what he called a woman suit that would resemble his mother, and it would allow him to, quote, crawl into his mother's skin. He was deemed unfit to stand trial, and he was sent to a mental hospital where he stayed until his death in 1984. Here is just a sampling of some of the things that Ed Gein made using human body parts. What is not pictured here are things like his lampshade, his seat, as well as his gloves and his belt. If you feel so inclined, you can Google those things. All right, that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments section what you thought of today's stories. I'll get back to all the early commenters, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's stories and you haven't done this already, please tar and feather the like button, and then subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly. In 1985, Kevin O'Keefe was a 36-year-old outdoor enthusiast that lived in Sacramento, California. He loved being out in nature, going hiking and camping, and in fact, he had always wanted to go camping in Alaska. By the summer of 1985, Kevin was actually doing research on areas in Alaska that he could potentially go camping, and he settled on this area called Glacier Bay National Park, which even by Alaskan standards is particularly wild and totally remote. Kevin planned to go camping on his own, so he decided he would need to take a class on how to survive the Alaskan wilderness because he's going to be out there by himself, and he's chosen this place that's incredibly rugged. So he actually enrolled and participated in a class teaching you how to go camping in Alaska. Then on September 20th of 1985, he flew from Sacramento to Juneau, Alaska, where he commuted his way up to Glacier Bay National Park. When he arrived at the park's headquarters, he went up and introduced himself to the park rangers that were working there. He told them he'd be over near the Wolf Point area, which was an area right against the water, and he said he was going to be here for about 3 weeks. He planned on leaving on October 10th. So everybody who works there is aware that there's this guy, Kevin O'Keefe, who's going to be by himself for almost 3 weeks camping near the water. No one in Kevin's family or any of the park rangers heard from Kevin for the next couple of weeks. But the whole point of this trip was basically to escape reality and go live in nature for a few weeks, so no one's raising any red flags. A few weeks later, on October 8th, which is 2 days before Kevin said he was planning to leave the park, which he told park rangers and they knew he was there, a couple of park rangers were in a boat patrolling some waterways around Wolf Point, which is the area where Kevin was camping. The rangers decided to take a bit of a detour to get inside of Wolf Point and actually check in on Kevin and just see how he was doing, because they knew he was out here by himself. They're making their way down, and as they turned this last corner where they could finally see Kevin's sight, immediately they knew something was wrong. The first thing they noticed was Kevin's tent was not in the area that it was supposed to be in. There was kind of a designated spot on the soil where you'd place your tent. but his tent was actually down a few meters on this beach that butted up against his campsite, and some of his gear was outside of his tent. Not strewn everywhere, but outside of his tent, like you had placed it outside. As they're looking at his tent, they realized that the top strut that kind of held the top of the tent together was folded down. It looked like it had broken right in the middle. They called out for Kevin. He was nowhere around, and they kind of rationalized what they saw. They thought, he's leaving in a couple of days. My guess is he's probably preparing his campsite for an exit. Maybe he went out to, go on a day hike or something. I'm sure everything is fine. So they leave and come back the next day just to double check. And when they arrive, there's been no change. The tent is still sitting down on the beach with that strut collapsed. His gear is sitting outside of his tent like his sleeping bag and sleeping pad. It's clear that Kevin has not been to this campsite since the last time they saw him, which was 24 hours earlier. So now they're outright concerned and they decide to launch a search for Kevin. They began flying little airplanes over the area where Kevin's campsite was and the surrounding areas. No sign of Kevin. They brought ground searchers with dogs onto his campsite. They're looking everywhere. No sign of Kevin, but they did discover at his campsite that virtually all of the equipment you would expect to be at a campsite in Alaska of someone who's staying there for a few weeks, well, it was all there. He had his backpack fully packed as if he was going to go on a hike. It had food, it had extra clothes and water. It was all packed right up against a tree. All of his sleeping equipment and his cooking equipment. And oddly, there was lots of food that Kevin still had left at his campsite that was out in the open. And no animals had touched it, which is a complete anomaly. As they began searching the outer areas of his campsite, dogs were able to locate Kevin's boots, his glove liner, and his hat. They were tucked away in this gully about a half mile away from this campsite that they were not visible to the naked eye. It took dogs finding it to locate these items. After finding these items, the early speculation was it looks like Kevin was attacked by bears or some other predator. But the park rangers, who knew this area extremely well and had seen other bear attacks, said, I don't think this is a bear attack because there's no sign of a death struggle anywhere at his camp. If you get attacked by a big predator, you're going to fight for your life to save yourself. You're going to grab onto things and flail around. It's fairly obvious, and there's none of that. There's also no blood or remains or any indication that someone was hurt in this space. And if an animal had come into this camp and attacked Kevin and eaten Kevin, they certainly would have taken the food that was out and about in the campsite. But none of the food was touched. As the investigation continued, rangers would say how strange it was that no wild animals are coming into this campsite. There's no activity. There's nothing in the area. It's like the animals are staying away from Kevin's campsite. When they couldn't find any sign of Kevin, the investigators went to speak with Kevin's family and asked them, did he have any signs that he was looking to end his own life? Do you have any information you can give us about him? And they said, no, he was really happy, well-adjusted, excited about this trip. He had taken a class to prepare himself for this trip. He told us that he planned on taking a couple day hikes, but no overnights. And he had no plans to meet other people while he was there. He was just looking to be on his own in nature. But after just a few days, they had to call the search off because there was no sign of this guy. He was just gone. Knowing that all of Kevin's gear was still located at his campsite means he did not leave to go on one of those day hikes that he had told his family that he might be going on. Because going into the wilds of Alaska without your gear is a death sentence. So Kevin must have been at his campsite when something horrible happened to him. But we know it wasn't an animal attack because there was no sign of that and no animals were coming near this campsite. So if it wasn't an animal attack, then what was it that caused his tent to shift down to the beach and have his gear strewn about on the sand and have his boots and glove liner and hat be located a half mile away in some gully? And where's Kevin? On July 17, 2014, people at Amsterdam's bustling international airport began boarding Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 that was bound for Kuala Lumpur. The 283 passengers on board were from all over the world. Some were traveling for vacation, some were going home, others were just traveling for business. In addition to the 283 passengers, there were also 15 crew members that rounded out the flight to a total of 298 people on board MH17. One of the passengers, before walking down the runway to get on the flight, took a picture of the plane itself and uploaded it to Facebook and kind of jokingly captioned it, "If we go missing, this is what it looks like," in reference to another Malaysian Airlines flight, Flight 370, that had actually gone missing just a couple of months earlier. Once the boarding was complete on MH17, one of the passengers on board uploaded to Instagram a short video of passengers stuffing their luggage into bins and the captain coming over the intercom saying that, boarding is complete and it's time to turn off your cell phones as we prepare for takeoff. A 15-year-old Dutch boy named Gary Slock and his mother Petra had just sat down inside the plane and they could barely contain their excitement. The pair had signed up for what they were calling a vacation of a lifetime with a group that took single parents and their children on these lavish vacations. Gary, who was the goalkeeper for a soccer team, had been telling his family how jealous his teammates were of this trip he was about to go on with his mother. Before Gary turned off his phone, as instructed by the captain, he took a selfie of he and his mom grinning ear to ear, excited about their trip, and he uploaded it to Facebook for his friends and family to see. Gary turns off his cell phone, puts it away, and he and his mom sit back and get ready for takeoff. The plane takes off without a hitch. It gets up to cruising altitude, and it's going to be a long flight. It's about 12 hours from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, and so everybody on board's kind of settling in. They're getting their iPads out. They're getting a book out maybe. The crew is making their rounds, offering snacks and drinks, and people are looking out the window. It's a beautiful day, and everyone's just kind of settling in for a long flight. About 3 hours after takeoff, around 4 p.m., the captain of MH17 got in touch with air traffic control at the nearby airport, which was in Ukraine. The pilot told controllers that everything was fine. He was flight level, 33,000 feet. The controllers acknowledged that and said, "Hey, there's a little bit of air traffic in the direction you're going. You need to reroute your course very slightly." The pilot acknowledged this change in course and was beginning to tell them what he was going to do next when he cut out. The controllers on the ground in Ukraine began hailing MH17 to try to get the captain back online. They couldn't reach him. The plane had sent no distress signals, and over the course of their communication, the controllers had not noticed anything abnormal. And so this sudden radio silence really didn't make any sense. Yelena Brichenko was a 20-year-old bank teller living in Ukraine who happened to be looking up right as MH17 was flying overhead. She would later say that what she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. As she was watching, MH17 just explodes, and the people inside of the plane very clearly get ejected out of the plane. And she's watching as these people and bits of plane are falling from 33,000 feet, and they come crashing down in this huge fiery inferno. The theory, backed by US intelligence, was that pro-Russian separatists could have fired a missile at this plane thinking it was Ukrainian military. It was not. It was just civilians. All 298 people on board MH17 perished, including Gary and Petra. This is the selfie that Gary took moments before takeoff with his mother as they were excited about their vacation. Family and friends that saw this picture on Facebook would say that this image perfectly captures Gary's wonderful personality and the love that Gary and Petra had for each other. After spending 21 years in the US Army, a man retires and moves to Central Florida with his wife and young son. Although his family had plenty of money because he had a pension coming in and his wife still worked full-time, he just got bored really quickly after moving to Central Florida and decided he would just take a job doing something just to stay occupied. And so he ended up taking a job at a highway gas station. One of the primary reasons he chose this particular job is because the owners of the gas station didn't care if his son came along to help him stock shelves and hang out behind the cash register. And so for years, that's just how it went. The man would work at the gas station and his son would tag along. Even after his son became a teenager and you'd think might be wanting to do other things, well, the town was so small, there was almost nothing to do. So his son still came along well into his teenage years. One night in 1990, his son, who was 15 years old at the time, was at the station and he was actually taking a break sitting outside on a picnic table. He was reading a magazine, drinking a Mountain Dew, and it's dark out, and he notices out of the corner of his eye that there is a woman walking off of the highway towards the gas station. It was a very quiet night at the time, so there's no cars getting gas, there's nobody there, and there's not really anybody even driving on the highway, and so that's why she really stood out to him. And he turns and he notices her and he thinks to himself, no one ever walks to our gas station. We're on a highway. Everybody drives here. So she must have broken down and she must be coming here to try to use our phone to call a tow truck or something like that. So the woman is walking across the lot, coming closer and closer to the gas station, and the boy at this point has turned his attention back to his magazine, but he would say later that he kept looking up and keeping an eye on her because there was something off about her. The woman ultimately walks right behind him and goes in the door into the gas station. Doesn't acknowledge the boy, doesn't say hi to him, just walks straight inside, and she starts walking up and down the aisles of the gas station. Now, from where the boy was sitting, it's all glass, so he could clearly look in and see his father behind the counter, and he could see the head of this woman as she walked in and around all these aisles. And as soon as the woman was in the store, kind of pacing around the aisles, the boy put his magazine down and was just watching. And he noticed that she was not really shopping. She was just looking down for a few seconds, wouldn't pick anything up, so she wasn't buying anything. And she would look up at the counter where his father was, and she would just stare at him, and then she'd look back down at what she was doing, and she would go through all the aisles. And at some point, the woman just kind of abandons this phony, I'm pretending to shop routine, and just walks up to the counter. Now, nobody else is in the store. There's nobody else coming in. And so the boy could actually fairly clearly hear what she was saying to his father. And she told his father that she had broken down and she needed a ride, and could he drive her to Ocala, which was the next big town north of this gas station. And the boy would say that his father acted very strangely because his father is normally incredibly pleasant with all the customers. He's very chatty even. Like, he talks to everybody who comes in the store. But as soon as this woman had gone in, his dad had seemed kind of dismissive and almost rude to this woman, and when she was talking to him, asking for a ride, he just said, no, I won't give you a ride. The woman is annoyed by how quickly she's been shot down, but instead of just taking no for an answer, she turns and looks at the boy who's sitting out on the bench, who's looking right at her, and she points at the boy, and she says, what about him? Is he your son? Can he give me a ride? The boy notices that his father, who's not within her eyesight, is looking at his son going, no. Like, whatever she wants from you, you're going to say no to it. And the boy's a little bit confused by this because he's still trying to understand why his dad was so against helping this woman, because she clearly needs our help or someone's help. But he just took his dad at face value. And when the woman's pointing at him, he knew, the boy, that if she came over and asked him, he would say no. But it wouldn't come to that because the boy's father would say to the woman, no, my son's not going to give you a ride. You need to leave here immediately. Do not come back. Leave. We're not going to help you. She's furious. She's cussing him out. She storms out and slams the door. She starts cussing at the boy, and she walks off. The whole time she's turning around and flipping them off and screaming profanities at them, but she ultimately walks off, and the dad kind of followed her out and is standing next to his son as she walks off. And the boy asks his dad, like, what was her deal? Why did that happen? Why did you not want to help her? And the dad just said, I don't know. There was something off about her, and I don't know how to place it, but I did not want her around you. I knew I didn't want to give her a ride. I knew she had to go. A year later, the boy is in his room when he hears his dad in the other room yelling for him to come in here and look at the TV. So he runs into the TV room, and on the TV is the same woman from the gas station, better known as Eileen Wuornos. She was a serial killer who used to pick up her male victims at gas stations in Florida. It's unclear whether the boy or the boy's father were her next victims. But by the time she had shown up at that gas station, she had already killed 4 people. And following that interaction with them at the gas station, she had gone on to kill 3 more people, including someone in Ocala, Florida, which was the town she had asked them to give her a ride to. Eileen had been caught, that's why she was on TV, and she was later sentenced to death. In September 2006, 26-year-old Jodi Arias met 29-year-old Travis Alexander at a big business convention in Las Vegas. The two hit it off immediately, with Travis on the same day he met her inviting Jodi to be his guest at his company's formal dinner that night. After the dinner was over, Travis and Jodi stayed up all night chatting with each other, and the next day, Travis was telling his friends at this convention that he had, quote, found his wife. After the convention was over, Travis and Jodi would continue to see each other, even though it was a long-distance relationship. Travis lived in Arizona and Jodi lived in California. But they would meet up and they would travel and take beautiful pictures and post to social media. It just seemed like they were a dream couple that were so happy together. While the couple's social media posts might have made it seem like they were this perfect couple, Travis's friends began to notice some very strange behavior by Jody early on in their relationship. Jody just seemed totally obsessed with Travis. She could not keep her hands off of him. Travis would be talking to his friends, and Jody would come up beside him and literally grab onto him and cling to him. And Travis would try to push her off of him, and she would just come right back and grab onto him. But it wasn't playful and jokey and funny. It was like she literally needed to be holding on to Travis. Jody would get really upset anytime Travis was interacting with a female. Didn't matter their age or their relationship to Travis. It was like she just could not hack any other females in his life. She would follow Travis anytime he went to the bathroom, and she would put her ear to the door and try to eavesdrop in case there was somebody else in the bathroom that Travis could have been talking to. She began showing up to Travis's house totally unannounced at all hours. And one time when the house was locked and Travis wasn't even home, she snuck into the house through the doggy door. Initially, Travis's friends just thought it was weird behavior, but over time, they started to feel like Jody might actually be dangerous. And so they sat him down one day and they kind of had like an intervention. And they said, "Hey, Travis, there is something off about Jody. Her behavior is just totally weird, and it seems like she is just never going to let you go. I think you need to break this off and just find a way to cut ties with this woman." As they're speaking to him, they hear something outside of the room they're in, which had all the doors closed. And Travis stands up, walks over, opens the door, and standing right there is Jody. She was eavesdropping, and she was furious. And she looked in at all of them and gave them absolute death stares and stormed off. Shortly after this intervention, Travis takes his friend's advice and he does break it off with Jody, and he kind of moves on with his life. Now remember, he lives in Arizona and Jody lives in California. So you'd think it would be pretty easy to break up because you're never going to run into each other. And that's what Travis was kind of banking on, that he could get a fresh start and never see her again. But about 2 weeks after they broke up, Jody moved to Arizona. Around the same time, Travis starts dating a new woman named Lisa, and almost immediately, Jody starts stalking Lisa, showing up at her house, tapping on her windows and running away. She starts slashing Travis's tires. I mean, she was a total menace. She was trying to break them up. But a few months after she arrived in Arizona, Jody ultimately packs up and heads back to California in April of 2008. And Travis, Lisa, his girlfriend, and all of Travis's friends are so relieved. They felt like now the breakup is final. 2 months after Jody leaves Arizona and goes back to California, Travis misses a really big business meeting. And at first, his friends are calling him and kind of giving him a hard time about missing this meeting, but he wasn't responding. And after a couple of days, his friends decided they needed to go do a welfare check and make sure he really was okay. They go to his house, they open it up, and immediately when they walk in, they see blood on the carpet, and they're calling out for Travis. Travis is nowhere to be found. They walk through the house and they discover in the bathroom Travis's body. He was dead and laying in the tub. They call the police, who come over and immediately suspect Jody Arias, who denies that she was ever there, that she had left, she was in Arizona, that she had nothing to do with this. But during the investigation, they find a camera inside of the washing machine inside of Travis's house. They were able to dry it off and extract the last few pictures that were taken on the camera. The first few pictures are of Jody herself. She's clearly inside of Travis's house. And then at some point she goes into the bathroom where Travis was. He's taking a shower. She takes this picture, and then immediately following this picture, she proceeds to stab Travis to death. In May of 2013, Jody Arias was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in jail. In 2014, a 20-year-old man living in India named Maksud Khan had become completely and totally obsessed with tigers. His wife and his family weren't entirely sure what caused him to be so fixated on tigers, but they noticed after a kind of random trip to the zoo that he took, that he came home and all he could talk about were tigers. So they figured he must have seen tigers at the zoo and just become totally enamored with them. But Maksud's obsession with tigers was not just, love and affection for these animals, although certainly there was that. It was more of a dark fascination with tigers' savage nature. The story Maksud used to tell all the time to his friends and family was about this tiger that was in captivity, and one day its two trainers had gone into the cage to put a garland of flowers around its neck for maybe some ceremony or something, and the tiger just wasn't having it that day, and when they went to put it on its neck, the tiger kind of snapped and killed the 2 trainers. Now, Maqsood was not telling the story to kind of glorify the violence of it, or even to act like it wasn't a big deal that these trainers had been killed. He was telling the story with a reverence for these creatures that were kind of untamable, that even in captivity, they were in control, and he was just totally fascinated by them. In May of that year, Maqsood lost his job, something that unfortunately happened all the time for him because he was known to be kind of lazy and kind of happy-go-lucky, didn't take things very seriously. He had actually been fired from a job one time when he was supposed to be unloading sacks from a truck and got distracted by some small animal and ran after it, and his employer fired him for it. But his family depended on him, and they said, Maqsood, you got to go out and get another job. And so during the day, Maqsood would go out and tell his family, I'm going out job hunting. But what he was really doing is spending the little money his family had to go to the zoo to go look at these tigers that he was so in love with. So for the next 4 months, Maqsood would just lie to his family and would go to the zoo and stare at the tigers in their exhibit. And so one day when he was doing just that, on September 23rd, 2014, he was looking into the white tiger exhibit. Now, the way it was set up is there was an outer fence that all of the people who were at the zoo could stand right against. And it was an open air exhibit. Right on the other side of that fence, all the way around, was a little bit of land that protruded into the exhibit a little ways. And then it would drop straight down into a moat that was another layer of protection between the tigers and people, so they were not interacting. If you continued straight past the moat, it would go back up again to this little island right in the middle of this exhibit where all the tigers would spend all their time. For some reason that we don't fully understand, although one could guess that it was simply because Maqsood wanted a better look at the tigers, he climbed over that first fence, the one that no visitors are allowed to cross. And he walked to the edge of that piece of land that sits over that moat. And he's looking down at the tigers, and the guards are telling him to go back, get back on the other side of the fence. All of the other people that are there watching the tigers as well, the other visitors, they're saying, hey, come back, don't do what you're doing. And at some point, Maqsood fell 15 feet into the tiger enclosure. Immediately, an alarm goes off, waking up the tigers in their habitat, so they don't know what's going on. They're kind of looking around. And the people that are watching this happen from the safety of behind this fence, they're screaming and yelling, and they're trying to get security to come over, and they're trying to save this guy. It's just chaos. But what's really happening is they're totally inciting the tigers to see what the heck's going on. And very quickly, one of the tigers notices that there is now a person, Maqsood, who's in the moat. And the tiger jumps down into the moat and walks right over to Maqsood. And Maqsood is sitting there, and he's absolutely terrified. And people said that he was just praying, and he's huddled up against the side of the moat. And the tiger's just looking at him. The tiger's not showing signs that it's going to harm Maqsood. But the people that were watching this happen that are on the other side of this fence are either taking videos and pictures of the event, or some of them begin picking up rocks and throwing them at the tiger to try to, I guess, get the tiger to leave Maqsood alone. 10 minutes goes by of people throwing rocks at this tiger, and the tiger gets really upset. And so what do you think happens once the tiger gets upset? It attacks Maqsood. The tiger clamped down on Maqsood's neck and dragged him over to a grassy kind of hidden section within the enclosure. And by the time the staff finally showed up with a tranquilizer gun, it was too late for Maqsood. He was already dead. Here is the final picture of Maqsood after he's fallen inside of that moat. This is taken moments before this tiger would ultimately attack and kill him. The police would ultimately charge the zoo staff with death by negligence for their incredibly long response time and for not having any alternative rescue methods. In April of 1976, 19-year-old Stephen Thomas was asked by his good friend Bruce Weaver if he wanted to join Bruce and Bruce's 4 other friends on a hike in New York State. Steve didn't know these 4 others, but he really liked Bruce and he loved hiking, so he agreed to go. The mountain they were going to climb was Mount Marcy. It's one of the biggest mountains on the East Coast, and it's very rugged, it's very windy, the temperatures drop dramatically towards the summit. It's a dangerous place unless you treat it with respect. On the morning that Steve was leaving for this hike, his mother told him that she had a bad feeling about the hike and that maybe he should just cancel because it didn't seem like a good idea to be hiking such a rugged mountain with people he didn't know. But Steve, who had a lot of experience hiking, said it was totally fine, he was eager to go, and that he would see her in a couple of days. On April 12th, 1976, the 6 men are making their way up Mount Marcy, and they get near the summit by about 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon, and even though they could have pressed on and made their way up to the summit, they were all really exhausted from the trip so far, and they decided they would make camp where they were and they would attack the summit the next day, and they were all eager to do that, with the exception of Steve. Steve didn't want to stop. Steve was sitting in Bruce's tent looking at the map of Mount Marcy, and he said to Bruce, "Hey, do you want to go for a quick walk with me? I just want to walk up the path a little ways." And Bruce was like, "No, man, I'm tired. Let's just go tomorrow." And so Steve just continued to stay up looking at this map. He made tea for himself, and at some point, he folded the map up and said, "Hey, Bruce, I'm just going to walk up the path a little ways. I'll be right back." Bruce told Steve this was a bad idea. Don't go up there on your own. The temperatures are dropping. It's getting dark. It's windy. It's just a disaster waiting to happen. Plus, we're all going to be up there first thing in the morning, so there's no reason to go up right now. But Steve was like, I just don't want to sit here. I'm going to just go. So Steve begins to walk out. The other hikers that he didn't know too well are like, "Hey, man, just stay here." But again, Steve's not listening, and Steve continues up the trail. When Steve left, he must have thought he was only going to be gone for a few minutes because he threw on a rain jacket, this yellow rain jacket, over a t-shirt and pants because he'd been sitting in a warm tent. He just threw on a jacket and he left his backpack. He just walked out with no supplies and began walking up this trail. At the time Steve was walking down that path, the snow was very hard packed, so it was easy to walk on, and there was a full moon, so there was great visibility. So it was a good night to be doing what Steve was doing, albeit if it had just been for a few minutes. So as Steve is walking away from the camp, even though the other hikers were annoyed with him, they weren't concerned. He had loads of hiking experience in Washington State. He was very eager to do this, and again, it was well lit. The snow was hard packed. They're thinking, okay, he'll be gone for a couple of minutes and then we'll see him again and it'll be just fine. After about an hour, it was dark and the temperatures are now well below freezing, and Steve has not come back yet, and he was not dressed for the sub-freezing temperatures. So the hikers walk a little ways down the path and they're yelling out for Steve, but there's no response. They decide that they have to go up the path and look for him because the conditions are going to kill him if he doesn't come back and get in his tent soon. When they go back to their tent to get some of their equipment to go make this trek to go find Steve, one of those 4 hikers that Steve did not know particularly well had brought his dog along for this hike, which apparently he always did. This dog was highly energetic, went everywhere with this guy. He loved hiking. Anytime the dog could go out and go run around, it would do it in a heartbeat. And when this hiker went in his tent to not only get his own gear, but to get his dog and bring his dog with him to go look for Steve, the dog refused to leave the tent. In fact, it cowered in the back of the tent and acted like it was scared of something that was outside of the tent. The dog's owner would tell investigators later that he's never seen his dog act that way. He was acting scared of something to the point where he would stay in the tent and all the hikers would go looking for Steve. The dog would rather be alone in a tent, totally isolated, than leave that tent. That's how scared he was of whatever it was that was out there. So the men go out looking and they can't find Steve. And after a little bit, they end up going back because it's just so dangerous to look for him in the middle of the night. So the group heads back to their tents and they're just praying that he found shelter somewhere on the mountain. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, the hikers immediately start looking for Steve, yelling for Steve. There's no sign of him. And at some point, half the group leaves and walks the 4 hours down the trail to a vehicle where they could go drive and get authorities, while the other 3 continue to look and stay near the camp just in case Steve were to return. Once authorities were notified, they launched one of the largest search and rescue efforts in the history of New York. They spent 2 weeks combing this entire mountain. Helicopters, dog teams, searchers on the ground. They are looking everywhere. There is no sign of Steve, even though he had this bright yellow jacket on. They can't find anything. He's just totally gone. After the official search was terminated after about 2 weeks, Steve's older brother, Bob, who was 26 years old, in amazing shape and very close with his brother Steve, he quits his job and moves to the Mount Marcy area and spent a whole year searching every inch of this mountain. Veteran park rangers at Mount Marcy would joke that Bob knew the mountain better than they did. Bob had apparently walked over 2,500 miles on Mount Marcy and had summited 600 times or more, and every time he would take a different route and search all along the mountain. He has looked everywhere, and he can't find his brother. Although Bob would never find his brother, he did locate the remains of a hiker who had gone missing 3 years earlier, so he was able to provide closure for that family. So why did Steve feel the need to walk up this trail in the first place? And then what was the dog so scared of after Steve vanished? Because the dog never acted that way. But suddenly something was so terrifying on the outside of their tents that it abandoned its owner and huddled in the tent in fear. And then how could Bob have missed his brother Steve, who was wearing a bright yellow jacket after combing every inch of this mountain? The only logical answer is that Steve is not on the mountain. But if he's not on the mountain, where is he? So like all of the missing 411 cases, we don't know what happened to these people, and we probably never will. But that doesn't stop us from theorizing about what could have happened to them. So get in the comments and give me your best theory about what's happening to these people. And not only will I get back to all the early commenters, I'll also pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's story and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button your seat. And then when they go to sit down, pull the seat out from behind them. Also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to learn more about the missing 411 phenomenon, I would encourage you to check out the Missing 411 book series by David Paulides. He's the one who created Missing 411. He's the one doing all the research. He's incredible. I put a link below in the description of how to purchase his books. I've also included his YouTube channel where he talks about a lot of these cases. In the 1970s, a young woman and young man were on their very first date together, and it wasn't going very well. It wasn't going badly. It was just really, really awkward. They just were not meshing at all. And so as they're getting ready to leave and retire for the night, the guy is thinking to himself, I have nothing to lose here. We're probably not going to go on a second date. And he says to the woman, hey, do you want to not go home right now and actually come on a hike with me? And he goes, I know this sounds like a terrible idea, but hear me out. I go mountain climbing in this area called Provo Canyon. It's not that far from here. There are these beautiful trails that lead up the side of the canyon to these amazing scenic overlooks. And tonight it's a new moon, so there's great visibility. And I just think that you might enjoy it. And so at first, the woman is obviously a little bit hesitant. But when he says, look, I go hiking there at night all the time. I love it out there. And I promise if there's any weirdness, if you don't like being there, we'll just turn around and leave. It's totally safe. And so after a little bit of coaxing, she finally says, okay, you know what? That sounds fun. Let's go do it. And so their date that had been really awkward suddenly became really exciting. And the two of them were kind of like thrilled, like, wow, look at us making our way up for a nighttime hike through Provo Canyon. And so they arrive at the mouth of this canyon, and they're both obviously excited. And they hop out and they start walking up this trail that brings them into a heavily forested section of the canyon. Now, to this point, the guy felt like this was a really great idea. He really had gone hiking here a bunch, and he really did know the area well. But as the trail brought them into the forested area, the guy remembers feeling this overwhelming sense of dread. He didn't know why. It was just like an overwhelming sense of anxiety that something bad was going to happen to them. But he had worked so hard to convince his date to come with him, and had convinced her it was safe, that he's not about to let on to her that there was anything wrong with what they were doing. And so he put on, his strong face and just kind of suppressed it and just kept on walking and, holding her hand tight, and they just continued their walk. But his sense of dread would just build and build to the point where he was really on edge. And what he didn't know, but would find out later, is that his date, the woman, she also had this horrible sense of dread as soon as they went into the forest. But she didn't want to tell him because she didn't want to seem like a party pooper, because he seemed really excited about it. At some point, as they're walking down this path, the man steps on something that felt soft. He didn't know what it was, but it caused him to freeze immediately, and he's holding her hand. He kind of jerks her to get her to stop. And before he can even look down and see what he's standing on, he hears rustling coming from the bushes just off the trail. She hears it too, and both of them, without saying a word to each other, because again, you got to remember, they're both really stressed. They haven't let on to the other how stressed they are, but they're both basically ready to leave. And so the two of them turn around and they hightail it out of there. He has no idea what he stepped on. They don't know what they heard in the bushes, but they don't care. The anxiety was so high, they just wanted to leave. Years later, that man and woman who had this very strange date would actually be married. And they'd be sitting down watching TV together, and they're flipping through the channels, and they land on an interview with a death row inmate. And the interviewer is asking the inmate, was there ever a time that you were almost caught red-handed? And the guy being interviewed says, yes, one time. I was in the forest up in Provo Canyon one night, and a young couple came walking up the trail. I didn't see them, so I only had a chance to jump into the bushes right next to the trail, and the guy actually stepped on the body of a girl I had just killed. But for some reason, he didn't look down and see what he was standing on, and the two of them didn't notice me just a few feet away from them. They just turned around and walked away. Turns out that young couple had run into one of the worst serial killers of all time, Ted Bundy. Before Bundy was executed, he confessed to over 30 murders, but many people believe the true number of victims is much, much, much higher. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know what you thought of these 3 stories in the comments section, and let me know how you would respond if it turned out you had actually interacted with a serial killer. Not only will I respond to all the early commenters, I will also pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's story and you haven't done this already, please schedule the like button for a fight with Paul the day before Thanksgiving in Quincy, Massachusetts. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. From the outside, Bart Whitaker appeared to love his family. He and his younger brother Kevin were extremely close, and Bart and his father shared a passion for long-distance cycling and would often go out and bike around the neighborhood together. Bart's family would regularly go on vacation to places like Cancun, and the pictures of Bart with his family on these vacations are always him beaming with happiness and love for his family. On December 10th, 2003, Bart, who was 23, almost 24 years old at the time, made a special announcement to his family. He told his family that he had just finished taking his final exams of his senior year at nearby Sam Houston State College and that he was going to graduate. Bart was not a natural student and frankly struggled in college, and so this was a really big announcement, and the family was really excited for him, especially his parents. And so they said, we have to go out and celebrate. And so they went out to a restaurant, and they're having this really expensive, lavish dinner. And in fact, his parents had bought a really nice Rolex watch to give to Bart if he were to graduate college. And so here he is announcing it, and they thought, you know what, now's a good time to give it to him. They give him his Rolex, and they're asking people at nearby tables to take their pictures, and everybody just seems so happy, and the parents are so proud of Bart. After they finish dinner, they're all smiles, they pile back in the family car, and they start making their drive back to Sugar Land, Texas, where the Whitaker residence was. It was inside of this upper-class suburb about 40 minutes away from Houston, Texas. On the drive home, his parents are endlessly talking about how proud they are of Bart and how excited they are for his future. They get back to their house, they pull in the driveway, and Bart's brother and parents make their way up to the front door. Bart is behind them, and he says, hey, I forgot something in the car. He turns around and goes back to the car as his brother and his parents walk into the house and are immediately gunned down by an assassin waiting inside of the Whitaker residence. Bart hears the shooting and runs back inside the house. He sees his family is down. He ends up wrestling with the shooter, who ends up shooting him but hits him in the arm before escaping the house. A neighbor hears the shooting and runs outside and sees this chaotic scene. They call 911. Police show up, and Bart's brother, Kevin, has passed away, as well as his mother. They both died on scene. As for Bart and Bart's father, they would go to the hospital and they would both make a full recovery. So this huge investigation is launched to figure out who this assassin was and why he was attacking the Whitaker family. And quickly they discovered that Bart Whitaker had hired him. Bart Whitaker wanted his family killed so he could take their money. And he had the assassin shoot him in the arm to make it look like, this was not his fault and he wasn't involved. Here's a picture from the night they were out celebrating Bart's big accomplishment that he had finished his final exams, except Bart was a total liar and he had stopped going to classes ages ago. He was failing every class and was not even close to graduating. In this picture, Bart knows that the assassin he hired is currently sitting in their house, waiting for them to return when he is going to open fire and kill Bart's family. The people in this picture with him are going to be murdered literally hours later, and he knows it. Bart was convicted in 2007 for hiring the hitman and was given the death penalty, but 40 minutes before his execution, the governor of Texas commuted his sentence to a life sentence because, oddly enough, Bart's own father, one of the people he tried to have killed, had forgiven him and did not want to see his last remaining family member be. Soon after the Beatles dissolved in 1969, one of the 4 members, John Lennon, left his native England and moved to New York City. Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, took up residence in the Dakota, which is a very famous building that typically houses the rich and famous people of New York. As soon as Lennon moved to New York, he said that he felt relieved because he didn't have to worry about going outside night and getting mobbed by a massive crowd of people that were obsessed with the Beatles. There were people that were huge Beatles fans in New York, but they seemed more respectful, and they would ask for his autograph, but they would mostly leave him alone. Mark David Chapman had always been a massive fan of the Beatles with a particular interest in John Lennon. But after a 1966 interview where John Lennon kind of off the cuff said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, this soured Chapman's adoration of Lennon. One of Chapman's high school friends recalls around this time frame Chapman rewriting the song Imagine by John Lennon to read Imagine if John Lennon was dead. Chapman started referring to Lennon as a poser and said that he espoused virtues and ideals that he himself did not practice. And so in relative short order, following that 1966 interview, Chapman went from this adoring fan of the Beatles and John Lennon to really solely hating John Lennon and everything he stood for. By 1980, it's safe to say Mark Chapman had become obsessed with John Lennon. Specifically, he had become obsessed with hating John Lennon. In October of 1980, Chapman quits his job as a security guard and flies to New York City. For 2 months, he stayed in the city and didn't really do much of anything. He would just periodically walk past the Dakota where John Lennon supposedly was living, but beyond that, he really didn't do anything in the city. But that would all change on December 8th, 1980. On that day, Chapman went to the Dakota, and he stood right outside the entrance to this building and just waited in hopes that he might run into John Lennon. At 5 p.m. that day, John Lennon comes out with his wife Yoko Ono, and they walk right past Mark Chapman, who flags them down, and he asks John if he can have his autograph. And John Lennon, even though he has a limousine waiting for him, and there's people that are starting to notice that, oh, that's John Lennon, people are coming over, John still took the time to sign an autograph for Mark Chapman. He was very friendly with Mark and asked him if this is enough. Do you want anything else? And Mark said, no, that's it. That's fine. And John Lennon said, okay, take care. And John and his wife Yoko Ono turned and went into the limousine and they drove away. When the couple got back to the Dakota that night, Mark Chapman had not left. John Lennon and Yoko Ono get out of their vehicle and they walk past Mark Chapman, who's standing right outside the front door. It's unclear if Mark and John had any interaction, but as soon as they passed Mark and were making their way into the building, Mark Chapman drew a gun and shot John Lennon 4 times in the back. And John Lennon staggers into the lobby screaming, I'm shot, before collapsing and dying. And Mark Chapman, he knew what he was doing. He just stood there, put the gun back in his pocket and just waited to be arrested. Chapman's lawyers wanted him to plead insanity, but he refused and instead said, I was totally sane. I knew what I was doing. I chose to shoot John Lennon and I plead guilty. And he was given 20 years to life in jail. And while he was in jail, he would admit that the only reason he did that was to become famous. That was it. This is the picture of Mark Chapman getting that autograph from John Lennon in front of the Dakota just hours before he would gun him down. He's still in jail today, and he actually just had his 11th parole hearing last month in August of 2020, and it was denied. In 2000, Patrick Whalen was 33 years old, and he was described as being an outdoor enthusiast, bordering on full-blown survivalist. He had hiked thousands of miles across the Pacific Crest Trail and had spent hundreds of hours camping inside of national parks, in particular the Glacier National Park in Montana. That was his absolute favorite place to go. In fact, he spent so much time there that the park rangers recognized him and knew him by name. On November 2nd, 2000, Pat was driving in Kiowa Junction in Montana when he hit a deer. Witnesses say that he stopped his truck, he got out, walked over to the deer, pulled it to the side of the road, took a pillow out of his truck, put it under the deer's head, and then he went and got food from his truck and put it near the deer's mouth, and then he just walked away. He abandons his truck. It's unclear whether his truck was not operational at this point or if he was just abandoning his truck, but either way, his truck would get towed the next day. 6 months after the deer incident, Patrick's father called the park rangers at the Glacier National Park in Montana, and he said, I haven't heard from my son in months, and I'm worried about him. I can't get in touch with him. If there was one place he would be, it would be at your park. Have you seen him? The park rangers, who again, they all knew Pat, they said, we haven't seen him, but we'll keep an eye out for him. A couple of weeks later, 2 of these park rangers are out on a routine patrol through the park when they come across a very odd scene. They saw this blue tent sitting in the middle of this campsite. There's no one around it, and the middle strut that held the tent together was collapsed. They yelled out to see if anybody was inside the tent to make sure everything was okay, but no one calls back. They walk over to the tent itself, and they can tell that this tent has been out here for some time. It looks very weathered and sun-bleached, but there's no tears in the fabric, and all of the zippers are shut. When they opened up the tent, there was no one inside, but there were all the things you would expect to find inside of a tent at a campsite. Water, food, stove, boots, clothes, it's all in there. But again, the tent is collapsed, and based on the pattern of sun bleaching on the outside, it had been collapsed for some time. When the park rangers filed their report about what they found, they noted that it was really odd that no animals had ransacked this tent, because clearly it had been sitting here unoccupied for a while and there was food in the tent, but no animals had touched it. Authorities show up and they begin searching the area for Pat. There's no sign of him. They bring out cadaver sniffing dogs. They don't pick up any scent. One of the issues they were up against was they had no idea how long it had been since he had arrived here and then subsequently disappeared, because they actually went to the tow yard where he had his truck towed following hitting that deer 6 months earlier, and his truck was still sitting in the tow lot. So he hadn't claimed his truck. That was 6 months earlier, and here we are, and there's this tent in the middle of the woods, and we have no idea where he is. But the most interesting and terrifying thing that was discovered was inside of his tent, there was an empty buck knife case. So the sheath was there, no knife. David Paulides offers a very interesting theory about why it was there. He suggests that while Patrick was living at this campsite, he must have been in his tent one night and he hears something outside of his tent that apparently was formidable enough that he felt the need to take his knife out and go out into the open to confront it. He gets out. The mosquitoes were very bad in that area, so he probably hopped out, zipped his tent shut for a minute. He's standing there with his knife to confront whatever this is, and then he doesn't go back into his tent. Whatever was out there apparently got the best of Pat. But we can't just say he was attacked by an animal, because there was no blood, there was no remains, there was no sign of a death struggle in that campground, and the food that was in his tent was untouched. No animal had tried to rip open the tent to get to the food, something that animals do after they attack people at their campsites. So the million-dollar question is, if it wasn't a wild animal that he was getting out of his tent with his knife to confront, then who or what was it? And where's Patrick? By September of 1985, the Nevado del Ruiz volcano in Colombia was starting to show signs of significant activity. The tremors had become so powerful that the citizens of a nearby town called Amero, that was home to 31,000 people, they started to become very concerned. If this thing were to go off, we're only 30 miles away, we'd be leveled. And unfortunately, just a couple of months later, on November 13th, 1985, the volcano would erupt, and it would create a massive mudslide that would just devastate Amero. The mudflow covered 85% of this town in heavy, thick sludge. It destroyed buildings and bridges, and it killed 25,000 people. Remember, there's only 31,000 people in this village to begin with, so 80% of the population has been killed by this mudslide. Because of how big of a disaster this was, it took a while for the rescue efforts to mobilize, and so anybody that was on the fringe of being saved unfortunately perished because no one was there to rescue them in time. And then when rescue crews did get out and did start helping people, there just wasn't enough. There weren't enough people to help. And so hundreds of people that could have been saved were just trapped and no one could get to them in time. Photojournalist Frank Fournier arrived in Colombia 2 days after this eruption with the intent to photograph the ground rescue that was going on inside of Amero. When he actually arrived in Amero, he was really shocked to see just how completely destroyed this town was and how totally ineffective the rescue efforts were. It was just totally chaotic. It wasn't really clear who was helping who. There were people literally dying all over the place. It just seemed crazy that this was not being handled better. Amid this chaos, a farmer approached Frank and told him he needed to come over and try to help this girl who was trapped under a house. So he brings Frank over to this house that's been completely submerged in water and mud, and clinging to a branch is this 13-year-old girl named Omaira Sanchez that's been trapped up to her neck in water. She's pinned by something in the water. They didn't know what it was, but she's been there for 60 hours. When Frank arrived, he spoke to the other rescuers that were there trying to get her out. And they said that she's been in great spirits and she's been joking about how she doesn't want to be late for school. She's just been a really positive force and we really want to get her out. But, it keeps raining, so the water keeps rising and she's already up to her neck and she's just trapped. We can't get her out. Shortly after Frank arrives, Omaira went from chipper and lively and kind of making light of everything to most likely realizing that she wasn't going to get out of the water. And so she began telling the rescue workers to let her be, to let her rest. And she propped herself over this branch and she just laid there, kind of allowing herself to pass away. Frank felt totally helpless. I mean, he's looking at this poor girl that's going to die unless they can get her out of the water, but no one seems to be able to do it. And it just seemed totally impossible that we can't just find a way to get her out. But it would turn out that her foot was pinned under a brick door, and her aunt, who had passed away and was trapped under the rubble, had grabbed her ankle and had died that way. So it was like a death grip on her ankle. And so, not knowing what to do, Frank just did what he knew how to do, which was take pictures. And he knelt down and he took this picture of Elmira. And very shortly after this picture was taken, she would pass away. This picture would win the 1986 World Press Photo of the Year. When it was published, it was so disturbing that this poor girl was not able to be rescued that it created an international backlash on Colombia's nearly non-existent rescue. In the late 1970s, a medical student going to school in Chicago had just gotten out of class and decided he didn't want to pay for a taxi, so he decided he would hitchhike his way home. Now, this was something he routinely did and at the time was socially acceptable. So he goes down to the road and he puts his thumb out, and eventually a car pulls up, and he would describe the man that is pulling up as looking normal and even friendly and lighthearted. It's a middle-aged guy, and he tells the student, "Hey, come on in, hop inside, I'll give you a ride." The student did not feel threatened by this guy and felt like overall this was safe, and so he hops in the passenger seat. He tells this man where he wants to go. He says, okay, and they start driving off. So as they're driving, it's silent in the car. They're not making chit-chat. They're just driving along. And the student notices that the man misses the turn to go where he needs to go. And so the student turns to the man and says, "Hey, you missed the turn. Do you mind turning around and going back this way? Or, if you want, you can just drop me off here and I'm happy to walk. We're not that far away." The man, who had seemed really nice and lighthearted, suddenly had this really intense demeanor come over him. And he turns and looks at the student and goes, "Oh no, you're coming with me." The student is frozen in fear. He doesn't know what to do, but he knows immediately that this is not an idle threat. I don't know who he is. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be bad for me. I have to get out. And so as soon as the car began to slow down even a little bit, they're still driving. They're not stopped. The student unlocks the door, opens the car, and jumps out of the moving car and smashes into the ground, rolls against the side of the curb, but is ultimately unhurt. He's banged up from jumping out of a moving car, but he was able to stand up and run back to his house. He didn't call the police because he really didn't know what to tell them, because he didn't have a great description of the guy. He didn't have his license plate, and the guy didn't do anything totally aggressive. It was more of a threat, but an ambiguous threat at best. It wasn't really clear what he wanted to do with him. It definitely did not seem good, but it just wasn't enough for him to call the police. And so the student just feels lucky that he got out of there and moves on with his life. A couple of years go by. The student at this point has basically forgotten about this encounter with the stranger. And he's sitting in a cafe, he's drinking some coffee, and there's a TV on behind him. He wasn't paying attention to it, but the reporter on the TV said something that immediately piqued his interest. The reporter was talking about a guy that was currently on death row that apparently had removed all of the inside car door handles inside of his car after his first would-be victim, a college student, had apparently escaped by opening a car door while he was moving. The student runs over to the TV and sees on the screen there is an image of the guy they're talking about, this guy on death row, and it's the same guy who gave him a ride 2 years earlier. His name was John Wayne Gacy, aka the Killer Clown. He had killed over 30 men and boys in Chicago, and then after killing them in his clown room, he would stuff them into a secret crawl space in his basement. And although we can't be certain, it seems extremely likely that this med student was supposed to be the first victim of John Wayne Gacy, but he leapt out of the car, forcing John Wayne Gacy to change his strategy and make sure the next person was not able to do. John and Jackie Nill were a Canadian married couple that loved traveling to Thailand. In fact, they went there so often and loved it so much that they considered it their second home. In 2004, instead of spending Christmas with their family back home in Canada, they decided, you know what, we're empty nesters, we're on our own, let's go spend Christmas in a place that we love that's also warm, Thailand. And so they settled on one of their favorite spots in Thailand called Khao Lak. It's this beautiful beach town. They'd been there many times, and so they were pumped. On Christmas Day, they called their family and said they're having such a great time. The weather is beautiful. They have this wonderful beach right in front of them. And by all accounts, their vacation seemed to be going really perfectly. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, the couple woke up and decided to head down to the beach to spend the day lounging on the sand. But as soon as they stepped out of their villa and looked down at the beach, which was right outside of where they were staying, they saw this huge crowd of people standing on the sand. And even though it was early in the morning, John and Jackie knew immediately why they were down there. It was an extremely low tide. The water had receded so far that it was a spectacle. And so they had their digital camera with them and they just started taking pictures. What John and Jackie and the people down on the beach seem not to have realized is that that extreme low tide is actually an early indication of a tsunami tidal wave, where the water basically gets sucked way out in preparation for a massive wave. What John and Jackie and everybody down on that beach should have been doing that morning is turning around and running inland as far as they possibly can go and as high as they possibly can go. But they don't do that. In fact, it looks like no one has any idea what's about to happen. And so John and Jackie continue to take pictures, and you see this massive wave coming closer and closer with every picture they're taking until it wipes out everybody down on the beach and eventually wipes out John and Jackie. They would be swept away to their death along with 230,000 other people. John and Jackie's camera would be found on the beach a month later. The camera itself was destroyed, but the SIM card was intact. And the person who found it would take that SIM card, plug it into their computer, and here are the final pictures that were on that SIM card.